Are you able to do the record bit?
We're recording.
Perfect, thank you. So yeah, I've just got little bits of housekeeping. So if you keep yourselves on mute, but this is a really nice relaxed session as well. So if there is something as I'm going through the slides, just pop your hand up, or don't be afraid to, this is a kind of standard slide that we use. Don't be afraid to kind of shout out. Vari will be able to see you, whereas I can't once I start presenting. Or if you've got anything else, then just use the chat function and you can put it in. I do try and stop sort of in between bits. So if there's anything that you want to ask as you go, because this is a kind of a one-stop shop to everything funding. And then the last thing is, if you do have any technical issues while we're going through it, then just let us know, or drop an email to myself, which is Joan at hiclimatehub.co.uk, and we'll get you back in, or we'll try our best to help, okay? So I will explain actually, I'll introduce myself first and who we are. So I'm Joan Lawrie, and I'm the manager of the Highlands and Islands Climate Hub. This is our little team of smiley faces. We should probably have little crosses through the faces of Bethany and Marion at the moment, because they're both on maternity leave, but due back in the springtime. So we cover all of Highlands and the Northern Isles. My background is I am the hub manager now, but previously I was actually the development manager for Thurso Community Development Trust. So I don't write as many funding applications as I used to write, but when I was the development manager for the trust, which I only actually finished during February, I wrote a lot of funding applications and managed a lot of different funded projects as well. So I've got I've got a lot of experience in funding, both the writing ones and being very successful, and writing ones and not being successful. But I did have a track record of, I think, when I finished up at the trust, something like 95% of the funding applications that I wrote and submitted were successful. So I'm not very good at blowing my own trumpet, but I'm considered to be quite good when it comes to funding. So I'm just going to explain, first of all, just a tiny little bit about the hub. So because if there's some of you that haven't encountered us before, so we are the Highlands and Islands Climate Hub. We support the regions of Highland Council local authority area and Orkney and Shetland local authority area. So there is on this map a very vague blue outline that goes around it. We are part of a network of climate action hubs that are forming across Scotland. So we were one of the first, and the NESCAN hub, which covers Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, we were the two Pathfinder hubs, but there's now just about 17 hubs that are in various states of coming online. So the Fife Climate Action Hub is there and is in place, and it has staff, but most of the rest of them are currently in the kind of recruitment and setting up phase at the moment. But hope to be that there'll be 20 hubs online by 2024. And so we work in not just supporting community organisations that are throughout our region, but we're also working within that hub network as well. And quite looking forward to finding out what the strengths of those hubs are and what we can borrow from them as well, to support our members here. No, and now I'm going in the wrong direction. So again, just tiny little bit about the hub and what it is that we do. So our vision for communities throughout the Highlands and Islands is to be bold, collaborative and resilient by creating climate-friendly projects and initiatives which address the needs of their communities and lead to transformational climate-ready region. So really what we're there to do is to support community organisations who are doing any form of community climate action. But we do consider that to be almost like a little bit loose, because there's not very many community organisations or community groups that are now not working in this realm, because we all need to be making ourselves sustainable. We all need to be looking at what's our net zero practices, and then how that can then influence along with our communities. So the way that we do that support is, we've got development officers that are based throughout the region. and they can lend hands-on support. So anything from funding to project planning to if you do need an extra volunteer or a pair of hands for an event, then we can lend that additional capacity where we can. We're trying to encourage groups to work together. As you see, when we go through more of the funding things, the funding landscape is funding is becoming even more tighter and tighter as public sector budgets in particular get squeezed. So the more that we can encourage groups to collaborate together and to work together, then that may help to unlock funding. We provide education and training. So you're here in a funding masterclass tonight. We celebrate community climate action. We really love selling the positives of what our communities are doing. Capacity building. So again, that's like building the capacity, building the skills within the community and the voluntary sector to be able to be stronger, to find the funding, to run the projects. Giving a voice to our communities. So we regularly key into Scottish Government policy, both formally and informally. And it's important that we gather the voice of communities so that we can help to shape that so that it is fit for what we need, particularly in our remote and rural areas. And we provide funding support. So I'll come on to that right at the end as well. And that we've got little bits of funding that are available to community organisations as well. So, funding. I'm going to start with funding trends. So the type of things that funders are generally looking to see and where funding generally sits. So funding does go through very distinct trends. A lot of it gets shaped by maybe what the Scottish Government national framework is. A lot of our big funders really speak to Scottish Government and Scottish Government speak to them. It can be also that the trends in funding is very heavily shaped by what's going on in the world. So when I first started doing this funding masterclass, the highest up funding trend, which has now come off it altogether, was actually COVID-19. So there was quite significant funds that opened to support activities during COVID-19. But at the moment, the kind of key funding trends that there are climate action. And that's not always that it is like very specifically something that is climatey, like growing or food waste or reuse. It can just be that there's a trend in there. More and more funders are asking to see how you're going to protect the environment, how you're going to be sustainable in your practices. So it's not always, like right there in center, but it's going to be there somewhere in a funding application. Cost of living crisis. There are definitely funds that are open at the moment, which are very much towards the cost of living crisis and supporting people through it. Sustainable development. We held a session this afternoon with the SSE Sustainable Development Fund. So looking at how projects are not just there for the now, how you're going to make them sustainable into the future. So there are probably key themes around that, particularly in our remote and rural areas, around housing, around energy production, those sort of projects. Mental health and well-being. Particularly linked to COVID, but I think more and more as it is recognised that the statutory services that should be dealing with more to do with mental health and well-being are not there. They're not able to cope because there is, such a crisis, that there are definitely funds that are open which are just purely directed towards improving mental health and well-being. Youth employment, and I'd actually say within that as well, skills development. So anything that you're doing that might be in and around developing skills of people within your community, which could be from simply giving digital skills to the kind of bigger projects which go back into climate action, of maybe potentially retrofitting buildings, things like that. Definitely skills development is where there is funding available. Reducing inequalities, so all of that kind of goes hand in hand. Like poverty reduction, just trying to create a level playing field for people. There's definitely funding trends in and around that. Active travel. Active travel actually has taken a little bit of a hit in terms of some of the funding, but if you were looking at a cycling project, there is definitely funds that are out there at the moment via Cycling UK, and via Cycling Scotland to encourage active travel. And then digital as well, just as that within that skills development, trying to get, as we all know, we live much more in a digital world now. And if you were looking at projects that are looking to improve digital skills for people, then there are definitely trends and funding for that. I've got up in this kind of corner here, I've got partnerships and evidence-based as well. That is taking aside any of these kind of smaller trends. What funders are definitely looking more and more to see is some form of partnership projects, and they're looking to see that there is evidence behind why a project might be needed. So that could be in the form of surveys, it could be just the form of evidence that you've gathered up from your community. We will come on to that a little bit later on as to what sort of things you need from there. But they're looking to see, funders are generally looking to see some kind of reason as to why this is important to this community and for it to be community led. So, first of all, is there anyone that has, when I go on to where to find funding, is this, like, just feel free to kind of shout out. Is there anybody that hasn't really kind of like, isn't sure where to find funding at the moment, or actually has something on their list that I might not have here? If I'm met with silence, then I'll just carry on talking. So it's very bizarre when you can't actually see anybody. So where to find funding. I think Lawrie is going to put some links into the chat as I go through some of these. I think it's your first starting point, isn't it? Is where to find funding. So you've got this project, you've got this great idea within your community, and you want to go and do something, but you don't have the foggiest clue as to where to start with it. So this is the list of all of the different places that I have ever found funding. The first one and the most official one is fundingscotland.com, which is a database that you can go on to, and you can search for funding for just about anything using different keywords. You can search through Funding Scotland either regionally, so you can have a look to see what might be available in your local area, or say in Highland or in Orkney or in Shetland, because there can be differences between where certain funding's available, particularly if it's coming via the local authority. But one of the benefits that I have always found from Funding Scotland, and first of all, I'm going to say that I have never gone on to Funding Scotland to search for a funder for a project that is live that I'm doing. I have always used Funding Scotland as almost like a kind of reference point, and that would be one of my big recommendations for it, is because funding, when you go and search through Funding Scotland, like if you went and put in maybe something like youth development, it will come up with pages and pages and pages of funders. But you'll actually find that a lot of the funding that's listed there is not currently open, because this is what happens with funding. It opens and it closes, it opens and it closes. But it's really, really good to use as a research tool to know if you're building some form of funding strategy for maybe a year, 2 years. Okay, so I've gone and had a look. There's youth development funding, but that doesn't look like that opens until maybe October of next year. I'll keep that in mind. It's really good for finding where there is funding that might potentially open that you can then keep a note of to keep an eye out on it opening. So I would use it kind of like as a research tool to just give yourself a good idea of what's out there. One of the other things that it's very good at is finding these really small funds, which are not really a funding application. They don't in so much open, but they're maybe like a small trust, something like that, which you actually just take and send a letter to and ask them, explain to them what your project is, and they'll randomly select, or they'll have some kind of criteria, but you basically write a letter and you might receive some funding that way. It's not something that I ever did for Thursday Community Development Trust, but prior to being with Thursday Community Development Trust, I actually used to work in a museum, and we did that regularly. Working within the museum environment was identify these kind of niche trusts and foundations that we would send letters to. Most of them we never heard anything back from, but occasionally we would get a check for anything between £100 and £10,000 that would be for basically keeping the lights switched on. It is a good, if you've got time, it is a good thing to go and do, but it could also be very disheartening because you are going to end up sending out a lot of these letters and maybe never hear anything back. So my next one is actually the best one. I think that it is either the best or the worst kept secret in community development in Scotland, and it's the Argyll and Bute Funding Finder. The Argyll and Bute Funding Finder is just the most amazing thing. It comes out once a month, pretty much always on the first of the month. It is a colour-coded Word document which goes through different sections of, like, if you're doing something to do with community development, if you're doing something to do with buildings, if you're doing something to do with sports development, if it's youth development, and it lists current finders. It's only about 7 or 8 pages long at max, so it's a really easy one to go and flick through. The one drawback to it is that it can sometimes list some local funds, but that are just local to Argyll and Bute, but they do have them in their own section, so you can kind of skip past that section. It is genuinely a work of art, and anybody can go and sign up to it. And I would absolutely advise that all of you go and sign up to it. It's absolutely, like, it is the best funding finder that I know of. Also signing up to various different newsletters. So wherever you might decide to be a member of, depending on what it is that you're doing. So things like Highland Third Sector Interface, Voluntary Action Orkney, the Shetland Voluntary Action, they have a very, very good funding finder that they send out regularly and have it in their newsletters. We will generally have funding opportunities that we become aware of in our newsletter. We're also working on a funding finder, which I secretly want to make better than the Argyll and Bute one, but we've not quite got that into effect yet. But signing up as kind of members, and I like just going and signing up to various different newsletters, you will start to get funding information that starts coming through into your inbox. Scotland's Towns Partnership, they also produce a funding finder, which generally goes out monthly. It is very, very long in comparison to the Argyll and Bute funding finder. Scotland's Towns Partnership funding finder is a 60 to 70 page Word document. You do also need to be a member of Scotland's Towns Partnership, but there are people that will be able to forward it on to you. Usually your council ward manager would be able to get that town partnership funding finder. I also get it, and I'm quite happy to forward it on to anybody that I have on my list. I've got a wee list of people that I send it to already, and if it is something that you're interested in, it is really, really long, and I think because of that, I've only ever used it when I've been just in dire need of trying to find some funding to keep a project going, because it's quite unwieldy to get through. Also, like, keeping note of who the main funders are in Scotland. So we've listed Foundation Scotland mainly because Foundation Scotland, because they deal a lot with the community benefit funds. So There is likely to be some funding that might be local to you that you can actually find out about via Foundation Scotland. Foundation Scotland do also manage some either nationwide or Highland-wide funds as well. And they are definitely worth a look at to see if there's any funding there for you. Similarly to that, it's a good idea to just be familiar with some of the big funders, so things like the National Lottery, Robertson Trust as well. Those are kind of main big funders in Scotland, and it's a good idea to just go and familiarise yourself with what it is that they are currently funding. The Robertson Trust, particularly for community organisations, are a really good funder, and they have a very clear funding strategy of what they're looking to fund over the next kind of 3 years, actually. So it's a good idea to go and have a look at them. Making the use of what networks are available to you. So if you are involved in a village hall, a building, a community planning partnership, knowing about these networks, and quite often then funding information gets shared within them. Even being part of the hub network, we would share funding information as well. And sorry, that's awareness of the main funders. I've kind of already covered that, which is like looking at Foundation Scotland, National Lottery, Robertson Trust, I would say are kind of they are your big main funders to be aware of and to know what they're looking at doing. One of the big tips that and this is where I kind of started from when I moved into working within development trusts, was the first thing that we did as Thursday Community Development Trust was we looked at we went out and surveyed and did lots of community engagement as to find out what the community actually wanted and what they needed. And based on that, we could start to see various different themes that were emerging. And then I went off and researched a lot of projects that were similar. We even went and did some community learning exchanges where you can actually be funded to go and visit another project. That's something that we can set up for you at the hub. And so between doing community learning exchanges and actually a lot of trawling of other organisations that I kind of admired and aspired to, either via social media or via websites, I started to see who was funding those projects. And so that then gave me a list of funders that I could potentially start to go to look at funding the projects that the community in Thurso had identified. Because that's one really good thing about a lot of community projects, is that we always acknowledge who our funders are. So it's fairly easy information to try and find out who funded that community garden, who funded that community fridge, who funded that village hall. You know, it's you can go and try and find out this information and then try and find out a little bit more about the funding. And then my other big one is social media, as much as I hate to say it because I'm not a big fan of social media, but going and following the right things on social media. So going and following things like Foundation Scotland, going and following us, Development Trust Association Scotland, anybody who's Highland TSI, the Orkney and the Shetland Caithness Voluntary Group, if you're in Caithness, if you go and follow these kind of organisations on social media, then they are generally going to, you know, like we all get emails into our inbox to say, can you please publicise this funding that we've opened? So they're good places to try and find out more information about funding. So is there anybody that has any questions so far that might save my voice for 2 minutes? No?
I was going to add in, Joan, as well, just to look at local funds as well. Was that on the, I don't know if I missed that too, but yeah, particularly like local benefit funds, like we've got one in Kinlochleven, that they're often under applied to as well. So yeah, don't skimp on that. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, I think I went with the Foundation Scotland because they manage a lot of them. But yeah, finding out who your local funders are, which if there's ones that are not sitting under the likes of Foundation Scotland, then your local voluntary group will know who the funds are. But also your community council is likely to know who they are because your community council would be involved in some kind of aspect with the setting up of that community benefit fund. So moving on to the funding top tips. So you have identified what your project is. You've decided this is what we want to do for our community. And you have got all your information. You're all set up. You're following the right people on social media. You have identified a funding opportunity, or you're getting deluged now actually with funding opportunities, either into your inbox through that Argyll and Bute funding finder. What's going to happen now is that you're going to just have all of these different funds coming at you, and you're going to be like, can we actually apply for this, or can we not apply for this? So I think this is like my kind of funding top tips, which is my first one is always read the guidance notes. Sometimes funding and protect, I found very much so, I still find it now, that when you start to be recognized as somebody who is involved in your community and is looking at applying for funding for different things, people will send you funds that they come across, and they don't always read the fine print on what that funding is. So my favourite one, whilst I was the development manager in Thurso, was we did various tourism projects. And I don't know how many people, do you know, actually, if Thurso Community Development Trust had £1 for every person who sent me the Scotland's Rural Tourism Infrastructure Fund, Thurso Community Development Trust wouldn't need to be applying for any more funding. Because I was just saying all the time, you can apply for this, Joan, you can apply for that, Joan. Even Highlands and Islands Enterprise used to send it to me. Thurso can't apply for that because when you read the small print of the Rural Tourism Infrastructure Fund, it only applies to settlements of less than 4,000 people, of which Thurso is not at 7,500 people. So there can always be little bits that are listed in the guidance. You might find that the types of things that might be listed in a guidance is, another good example is the Bank of Scotland funds. Bank of Scotland funds are actually highly competitive and are quite difficult to get, but they do come out fairly regularly. They put a lot of promotion behind them, but you do have to have 3 years worth of annual accounts before you can apply for any of the Bank of Scotland funds. There might be others where you need to have a certain income of either above a certain level or below a certain level. So the Cora Foundation, they're a funder who I actually haven't seen about for a while, but they gave out quite a lot of funding during COVID and COVID recovery. They fund quite a lot of mental health and wellbeing projects. They will only fund organisations that have got an income of less than £100,000, which a lot of smaller organisations, that's what you will have. But then I don't think we've got anybody here that's from like a development trust. When you start to move into the realms of development trusts, then quite often it doesn't apply to them. So yeah, so that is always go and read the guidance. If it feels like it's too good to be true, it might be too good to be true, or like it might be okay, but I would definitely always say is before you get too excited and start filling out a form and start putting any work into it, make sure that you have read all of the guidance notes that are there. The next thing is revenue costs and how much to budget. I'll come on to this a little bit more later on, but this is if you are looking for staffing, then making sure that you are budgeting the right amount of money. So, you know, if you're putting in for a salary of say 20,000 a year, actually that would be a pitiful salary. But if you were putting in for that, then you have to also make sure that you are putting in for your own costs on top of that as well. So as an employer, you would have national insurance, you have potentially training, you have a pension that you have to pay as well. So making sure that you are budgeting for all of that. I do have, if you're looking for staffing costs, I do have a spreadsheet that will actually calculate that for you, which I do actually need to adjust because there has been a change to national insurance just recently. But I can certainly provide that, but it's making sure that you are budgeting for everything. I think that's one of the other things is that within funding is what's the difference between revenue and capital, which I do come into a little bit later on. So revenue is what we always speak about, is that's running costs. Capital is your buildings, your equipment, those sort of things. Some funders are not keen on revenue costs. Some funders are not keen on capital costs. So you've got to make sure that you're applying for the right thing. Match funding, again, I do a bit more about this, but that when you're reading the guidelines, making sure that if they require a match funder, that you do have a match funder in place. So when we talk about match funding, funders like to have confidence sometimes in projects. They might not be the only funder, that there is another funder that's there. It makes for a stronger project if there's more than two funders who basically want to invest in you. So yeah, having an awareness of match funding is really important, and it is like slotting together a jigsaw puzzle. I wish that there was an easy answer to it. I've often been told that funding can sometimes be a bit of an art form, but it's just making sure that you have read that guidance and that you do know, like, you are aware if you have to try and find a match funder. My other top tips are always be clear and concise and tell a story. So funders don't actually need fancy words. You don't need to tell them fancy words. They just want to hear the story as to why you've arrived at what it is that you want to do and what it is that you're going to do and how you're going to achieve that. Also make sure these are all kind of bits that I go through in a bit more depth in a minute or two. Funding applications generally ask you to list what outcomes, so what it is that you're going to achieve. If you try and make sure and always have in your head that your outcomes should be smart, so they should be measurable in some way. So it's not just we're going to train some young people in doing this. It's like, actually, we're going to train 12 young people in doing exactly what you're going to be doing over a 12-month period. Like they want to know something that's specific, because that's then in turn what you're likely to have to report to on your your funder. Also have an awareness of your community. So whatever it is that you're looking to do, have an awareness of just the way that your community is. And have some statistics that you maybe throw in. So I've got listed there SIMD. So that's the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. There are some funders, and I'm going to come back to remind myself exactly who, but there is definitely some funders in Scotland that will only fund groups. So this is one of the things that you should read in guidance if you're actually in the top 20% of multiple deprivation in Scotland. There is an interactive map that you can find that will tell you what the SIMD statistics are for your community. It's not very many funders that are like that, but there are a few that are actually really looking for where there is kind of multiple deprivation. Your community plan and partnership should have locality plans in place. They should have surveyed the local communities. Might be that your local community either has a local place plan now as well, or is looking at doing a local place plan. You can get some statistics from there. The Highland Community Plan and Partnership website does have any that are listed. It's helpful to just go on and have a look and see if there are any plans for your area. At the moment, and I don't know where locality plans and community plan and partnerships are sitting currently in Orkney, but certainly in Highland, Caithness and Sutherland has got quite a large amount of statistical evidence about issues and experiences that are going on in the communities there. And I know that the Highland Community Plan and Partnership is undergoing a bit of a renaissance at the moment. So they will be looking at having that similar types of plans in all of the other areas as well. Whatever statistics you can glean. So even population statistics, if you've got statistics about how many people use your service, anything like that. And having any evidence as well. So surveys, case studies, anything, you know, it can go a long way into telling a story if you've got maybe a quote from a service user or something like that that you can put into a funding application. So, match funding. Has anybody come across any issues with match funding so far? I'm just going to continue. Every time I ask a question, it allows me to have a drink. Monica.
I try to avoid whenever I see the funder say that match funding, because I don't know where I can get another funder, or when I wouldn't get it approved when I apply for the second, this big one or whatever. So how do I justify it if they say they would like you to have match funding? So I don't even know whether I will get this one. How am I going to know that I will get the other one? So when they ask for match funding, I just avoid it. I just walk away, I just look for something else.
It is hard. I think the whole concept of match funding can be really, really difficult. And it can feel like it's quite overwhelming as well. There is a lot of there are becoming less funders actually now that require match funding.
Okay.
And I think one of the kind of key things that I've always found, I mean, we've got listed on here, like the advantages are it's a stronger application, it's more support. The disadvantages, just exactly as you said, Monica, the timing. And also different funders have differing outcomes. So funders are looking to fund what they want to fund. And they're not always going to want exactly the same thing. And you're likely to have to put in work to write a funding application in a slightly different way for one funder than what you do for the other funder. One of the things that I would say though is that a lot of funders are very, like, when you get that first one, and when you think about really big projects, like what you've got going on in Dunbeath, Maureen, like that's a huge project and you're going to need more than one funder. It's not going to come from just one. But actually a lot of funders are, when you're looking at that really big funding, it's having conversations with them. Quite often they are very understanding that it might be that you're not going to get that other bit of funding in enough time for what they think, and then they can change things around. I mean, we had a really good conversation this afternoon with the SSE Sustainable Development Fund, and they're a funder that if you were making an application to them now and you needed to get in the rest of your match funding, they'll hold on to that funding for 5 years for you and pay it in different financial years from where you need it. But that is few and far between. However, I think that there is things to be said about having conversations with funders, because funders are definitely becoming more and more adept to this idea that, well, we might have applied for that other funding, we've not got it. And that we need to go and try and apply for something else. It is, yeah, I mean, it is the nature of a lot of where community development is currently sitting, is that you do need to have these match funders. Where you have, but sometimes it can also be another way to look at match funding as well, and where some funders accept it, is that don't forget what you might be able to offer in kind as match funding. So that comes from your volunteer effort. It's always a good idea to record how many volunteers you have and how many hours your volunteers might be covering. I know it's easier said than done. You're already trying to run a community project and are busy. But if you have volunteers that are lending their skills and experience, that's things that are not being paid for. And that can be used as in kind match funding. Yeah, and even, if you're doing maybe like a bigger project where you've got, I don't know, people within your community that are, like, if you're doing something with buildings, that's something that I've done in the past, is used as a match funder. The lovely, friendly, we have public toilets in Thurso, which are notoriously difficult to fund. Nobody wants to fund public toilets. No, not even Highland Council wants to fund public toilets. But what I use as a match funder is the fact that, or what I did use as a match funder was the fact that the plumber who does all of the maintenance on those toilets is not paid. We'll never pay for the parts. So we calculate up what his time is, and then we use that as saying that it is a match fund. So you can do things like that. Where there is, like, if you need a small amount of match funding, then the Hub are always quite happy to support that. You might also find that there is smaller bits of project funding. So an example is we had a community garden and thought, well, we still have a community garden in Thurso, but when I was working on doing the funding for it, we applied for lottery funding. And we didn't, they needed a match funder, and we didn't particularly have a match funder there. But what we did, not to the level of what we were applying to for the lottery, but then we used as the match funding smaller funding pots that we knew that we could get the hold of. So things like Green Health Partnership, doing smaller projects within the bigger project and using that as the match funder. But it does, yeah, the timing can sometimes be off, but that's always that, have conversations with the funders. And then, yeah, that kind of thing about writing slightly differing outcomes, which I'll come on to in a little bit when I come on to actually writing a funding application, is that you just might have to skew things a little bit. The disadvantage is also that there's additional work, but it will make for a stronger project if you've got more than one funder. And also you have to think about your funders are also organizations that you can build relationships with as well. So if you've got more than one, if you think about it as going on Dragon's Den, you know, they're always delighted when they've got 2 dragons that want to invest in them, because you get different bits of skills and experience. So it can make for a stronger project. So we are now at the stage of, we have, what all have we gone through? So we have identified what our project is. We know now where we can find lots of different bits of funding. We've got a kind of general idea as to what we need to look at. We've realized that we might need more than one funder, and we're actually getting ready to sit down and write that funding application, because we've read all of the guidance notes, and we know that this is definitely a fund that we can apply for. So before you start to apply for your funding, because, and I've been caught out like this, when at the early stages of writing funding applications, you thought, you could think that, well, this is just the funding application form, and then you get to the end of it, and then they suddenly want all of this documentation that you've got to send with it as well. So it's a good idea to just know what documentation you're going to have to send, have a little folder on your computer that has the up-to-date versions of these documents, so that you are not going about rushing all over the place to try and find them. I think one of the first times that I did this Funding Masterclass, I just did it with groups in Caithness for a mental health project that we were actually involved in a partnership with. And it was trying to support groups across Caithness. I was still with the trust then, and heard a tale of somebody that they went to write, they were writing a funding application, they found out about it last minute, were going off to send it in, and then realised that they needed to send the constitution. They were a volunteer on the board. I think it was only the chairperson that had the constitution. They were away on holiday. They couldn't get the hold of the constitution. They ended up missing out on the funding application. So your governing document, your constitution, have it to hand. Make sure you've got an up-to-date version of it. Just have a copy of it in a folder that you know exactly where it is, because guaranteed pretty much all funding applications, you're going to have to send off a copy of your governing document. The other thing that you're going to have to send off is a copy of your most recent bank statement. You might not have to send it with the application, but when they do come back and say you've been awarded the funding, they are definitely want to see a copy of your bank statement. That is not to know how much money your organisation has in the account. It's so that they can verify that the bank details that you've given are correct. For me, being now on the other side of giving out funding, it is definitely like we do need to see bank statements, because quite often we get handwritten forms back and we've got the number wrong and we go, I don't know how many times backwards and forwards to just try and double check what the sort code and account number is. So have a copy of your most recent bank statement to hand. Some funders will ask for like the last 3 months bank statements if they're a big funder. If they're like Highland Council, that kind of things, it's just because they have to do a little bit of due diligence on their side as well. So have access to your most recent bank statement, potentially your last 3 months of bank statements. Your certified accounts. So this is another thing, have it in your folder. It must be your signed accounts. So if they've gone through an independent examination, have a copy of those accounts to hand for your most recent year end that you can send off. Again, with that governing state, with your constitution, your certified accounts, they're going to want to see them. It's part of the due diligence process that funders have. So just make sure that you have a copy of them. If you are a new organisation and you don't yet have certified accounts, that doesn't mean that a funder won't accept you. There's usually on a funding application, I'm trying to think exactly the way they phrase it. There's usually a couple of boxes at the top of it, which is like, have you got a copy of your most recent certified accounts? Or if you're a new organisation, can you provide a cash flow projection for the current financial year? So have an idea of what your cash flow projection might be. If that's something that you need any help with, I've got templates of Excel spreadsheets and things like that I can give you that would help you to do a cash flow projection. I'm also always quite happy to go through just doing that kind of bits and pieces with people as well. If you've got an annual report that sets differently from your certified accounts, then they might like to see an annual report. Some of us produce, for some of us, our certified accounts can be pretty dry. Some of us will include a nice annual report with our certified accounts. Just depends on what type of organisation you are and what level of income you're at. Usually the higher your level of income, the drier and the more boring your certified accounts become in your annual report. But you might have an annual report that shows like what's the impact of the work that you're doing. It has nice photographs in it and things like that. So yeah, sometimes your certified accounts and annual report can sometimes sit as 2 different documents, or it might just be one and the same. If you are doing any form of a project which relies on enterprise or earning an income, and you're looking for funding for that, a funder is likely going to want to see a copy of your business plan. Quite often those business plans don't need to be hugely extensive. Depends on what it is, the nature of what you're doing. Again, I'm just going to go back, just because we did it this afternoon with the SSE Sustainable Development Fund. If you were interested in applying for it at the moment, it's open. They're asking to see a business plan, but it doesn't need to be anything that you have specifically done for that fund. It can just be like some kind of a plan that has taken you up to the point where you are currently, that you're applying for their funding. Not all are going to need to see an extensive business plan. It just depends on what it is that you're doing. Again, I'm always quite happy to have a look at, if it is a project like that you're putting together, I'm quite happy to have a look at business plans. Evidence of community need. So you will need to provide, likely enough, and it might be that they want it separately as a separate document. Some of the Highland Council, the community regeneration funding that's been out recently by Highland Council, and I think the Nature Restoration Fund as well, they do like to see a separate document that is some form of a report, that maybe you've done some survey work, you've done some community engagement. It might be something that you have, it might not. It depends on the level of the project that it is that you're looking to do. You can quite easily put together surveys and put them out online, but quite often you know your community best. So it might be that you've got something that you've put together that's anecdotal evidence of what it is that your community needs. And it might be that you have to provide something in a separate document. For larger funders, you may need to provide something in a separate document. But for a lot of smaller funders, it's maybe just taking some of that evidence that you have and putting that into, weaving that through your funding application as you're writing it. What I do have down at the bottom there, though, is letters of support. And do not leave them until the last minutes, because I've been there and I've done that. Suddenly come to the end of a funding application and realise that, oh, crikey, I needed all of these letters of support. And I have certainly been approached by more than one organisation who, at potentially nearly midnight, that says, can I get a letter of support, Joan? Yeah, no bother. When do you need it? By 5 o'clock the next day or something like that. There are some, there's getting to be less and less funders now that need letters of support, but it is still a kind of key part in showing that you've got the support of your community, or you've got the support of organisations around you, into whatever the project is that you're looking to do. Now, letters of support, you can do it one of two ways. You could just approach people and you could ask them, explain to them what your project is and ask them to write some kind of a letter of support. But what commonly happens actually is that you would maybe create some form of a template letter and then send that around. Either members of your community or organisations that you are working with or that you know of. And then they can complete that letter of support and send it back to you, and then you send it off with your funding application. We are always happy to do letters of support for projects here from the Hub. I like to kind of know a little bit about your project and then write one that's actually like streamlined to you rather than doing a template one. But lots and lots of other organisations and things will do one that is working from a template. And the types of organisations like your local third sector interface or voluntary group, they will usually they're usually a good one to do a letter of support for you. If you can find a couple of people within your community that could do a letter of support for you, your community council as well are good ones to do letters of support for you. So any questions on paperwork before I move on at all?
Joan, I realise I missed I don't know if it was a question, but from Monica, who was saying that she's looking for funding specifically for kind of cost of living support. I shared the sort of Argyll and Butte funding finder that's tailored to cost of living, but just in case you knew of anything else.
I don't particularly know of anything else at the moment. I think that Argyll and Butte one is the better one. I don't think that the Highland Council has anything that's out at the moment that's cost of living. But I can certainly have a look for something more. Right.
Oh, wait, I think Monica's got a hand up as well.
Oh.
What is a strategic plan? I've never done one before.
So I think that I could probably do a whole training on a strategic plan.
Okay.
Monica. It's basically looking at what are you looking to do? So it's probably more common to development trusts. So development trusts, they operate basically from having this strategic plan. So like in Thurso, what we did was we went out, we did community consultation, community engagement, and we did a 5-year plan for what we wanted to see for the community. So it was where we wanted to go to from year 1 through to year 5.
But
and then we worked.
Doesn't it just the same as a business plan?
It can be. So for something like SHIMCAT for yourself,
yeah,
a strategic plan and a business plan is going to be one and the same for you.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's kind of like that. Where are we now? What is it we'd like to do? So what does that success look like? And building in, what's your building blocks that you need to do to get there?
Okay.
Joan, we've also got a question from Marguerite, who's just noted that she's recently been asked for more policy. So, for example, safeguarding fair work. Was there anything else you wanted to ask to Marguerite? Also, let me know if I'm saying your name wrong.
So I put my hand up after I put that in the chat, but no, it was just we developed a child protection policy because we are working with both primary and secondary school pupils for a recent application, and Highland Council were also looking for, that was a recent application, a fair work policy. Even though you're working with volunteers, they still wanted you to fill in, but they did provide the template for it, which was really helpful. But are there other policies that maybe people should put in place before making funding applications?
I should actually have that on that slide. I don't know why I don't. So child and adult protection, yes, you are generally going to be asked for that by a lot of funders. I'm actually fairly certain that Foundation Scotland, for example, asked for that as standard, that you've got a child and adult protection policy in place and they want to see a copy of it. I think the fair work, I think I'd never been asked for it before, Marguerite, other than for Highlands and Islands Enterprise. But I think that that is going to start coming in more and more, that you've got some kind of a fair work policy, even if you are working with volunteers. I think they just want to, it's a kind of key thing that's coming down through, and I would expect that most larger funders are going to want to see that fair work policy. But that's the other one that is actually springing to mind is probably that I know that I'd been asked for it before, and I think that more and more funders are going to start asking for it as some form of environmental policy or net zero policy as well. But adult and child protection is definitely a big one that you would be asked for.
Okay, yeah, that is one of the things we did, was put a sustainability policy. We had a net zero policy in place, or a zero carbon policy in place, but we extended that to be more a sustainability, overall sustainability policy. And I'm just noticing back on your slide there as well, that 1 hour per thousand, I felt from the last time I attended this, was a really, really useful guideline in terms of writing a decent application, you know. And I think it's really important if you're going to ask people for funds, and that was some of the feedback we got. They funded quality projects, not just quality applications, and that was shown through the investment of time putting into that application process. So that was a useful tip last time. Thank you.
That's okay. It was actually a tip that I got from somebody else, and as soon as they said it to me, I was like, ah, that makes sense. Yeah, I get that. So yeah, it was actually the chair of Thursday Community Development Trust that has always emphasised that one to me, especially when I would be tearing my hair out writing a funding application, and she'd be like, nah, stop putting as much work into that, or put more work into that one. This is your formula. So I'll just come on to that in a minute or two to explain a bit more about that. But we've kind of moved on to writing a funding application. So yeah, we're now, I can't remember where we are now in all of this different, the bits. We're basically now sitting down to write this funding application. You've identified the funding. This is where you want to go to. So this is the kind of the kind of tips that you need around writing a funding application. And I'll come on to this 1 hour per £1,000. So I was told this by the chair of Thursday Community Development Trust, and it then started to make complete and utter sense to me, is that you're basically, the basic formula for writing a funding application. Now, it's not a set in stone formula, because some funders ask loads of stuff and other ones don't. But in general, you should be dedicating about an hour of your time per £1,000 that you're applying for. So if you're writing an application for £1,000, it shouldn't take you that much more than an hour, really, to write it. Where you're looking at, but that doesn't mean, like, so if you're writing an application for £100,000, that doesn't mean that you are 100 hours sitting writing that application. It's all of the work that goes into it. So we've kind of gone through the different things that you need. And one of the key things that you need is evidence that this is what your community needs and this is what your community wants. So a lot of that is going in, that time is going into that. So actually, by the time you sit down and write an application, it's almost written for you. I've certainly found in the time that I have written funding, the easier funding applications to write are actually the great big massive funding applications, because I've got this huge body of evidence. It's all the work that has been getting done and in the background, which you don't always think about it. Like, and some of that work is just standing and speaking to maybe somebody in your community on the street about a certain project or about a certain need and identifying that needs. Is that so by the time you actually go to sit down and write those funding applications, you're very, very clear and what it is that you want to do. You know, you've kind of nailed everything down. But that's your general kind of equation, is that if you are, and I know when you're starting off, it's going to seem much harder to think, well, how can I write a funding application for £1,000 in an hour? But by the time you've got a few under your belt, then it becomes easier and easier, and so they become less and less daunting. But it kind of does start to give you an estimation of how much time you should be putting into it, because it is also, you know, you can send off a lot of funding applications and not be successful with them, and it can be fairly soul destroying. So it's kind of having that investment in time and what you actually want your project to be, and then sitting down and writing it. And actually that investment of time as to what you want your project to be, where the evidence is in your community for that project, by the time you sit down to actually write a funding application, okay, the first few are going to be a lot harder, but actually, if you've got that investment in time and what it is the community wants and what the community needs, and you know your story, then that funding application is going to more or less write itself. So don't get too hung up on the writing of it. The time goes into making sure that this is what your community wants and shaping your story and what it is that you're trying to actually do. So that's why it's like the first thing there for writing a funding application is do your research, know what it is that you're looking to do, know what your costs are in detail. So have an idea as to what it is, how much money do you actually need to make this project happen. So that can be that you have actually gained some quotes, particularly if it's to do with building or land, that you do have an idea of what the salary costs are, that you want to offer something, like that you just have a very realistic idea of what the costs are. I've got on there 3 quotes. Now, this can be the hard part when you are in remote and rural areas. And I'm very relieved to see that a lot of funders are now dropping it and are not insisting on it any longer. But if you're trying to do anything with building or land, then traditionally it had always been that you used to have 3 quotes. Now, I don't know what some of you are like in other areas of Highland or Orkney, but in Caithness, it's difficult enough to get the hold of one joiner to come and do something, let alone 3 to just come and give you a quote. So that's less and less likely to happen now. And actually, a lot of funders they might still insist, oh no, you need 3 quotes, you need 3 quotes. But actually, if you can justify, well, listen, we've only got one joiner in our village, we've only got one electrician, where am I meant to get these other quotes from? They won't hold you to it. But if you can try and find some different quotes that, and I mean, it's kind of comes down to being cost effective as well. But generally, funders don't hold you to this any longer, but it is something to be aware of that you might need to have. So when you come to writing this funding application, so you're going to have your costs and things like that. The next thing that one of the first things that you're going to be asked for is, on a funding application, it generally starts off with name of the organisation, the address, those sort of things. And then it's going to start to ask you about your organisation, like who are you? So there's usually always this paragraph that asks, like, it can be phrased in different ways. So it might ask, like, who your organisation is, who your board are. They might ask you just, like, tell us about your organisation. And that's your opportunity to give your little paragraph. Now, some organisations can quite easily have, you could go and write your kind of like organisation, tell us who you are. This is the answer. And you can go and use that on multiple different funding applications, and you don't need to rewrite it at all. You can just use the same one. When I worked at Caithness Horizons Museum and Art Gallery, we just generally had the one organisation track record that explained what Caithness Horizons was. Because we were a museum and an art gallery, it kind of said it on the tin what we were. So it was always very clear. But then going into the development trust field, sometimes some of the funding that we were applying for, so we were doing all sorts of different projects, going from tourism to climate action to community growing. So I would have it, I had a couple of sentences that were always fairly standard, in that Thurso Community Development Trust is the core aim of making Thurso a better place to live, work and visit. We're made up of a voluntary board, like that kind of thing. But I would then tailor that organisation track record as to what I was actually applying for. So obviously, if I was applying for something that was tourism related, I would mention more in our organisation track record about our Discover Thurso project, our tourism development plan, and I would probably mention less about the sharing shed, where we're sharing from. Whereas if I was applying for funding that was to do with maybe cost of living crisis or poverty alleviation, or maybe during COVID, then I would apply for more to do with, then I would mention more about maybe our old folks lunches or the work that we did with young mums. So you might want to tailor that bit about your organisation track record, particularly if you're doing various different things. You're generally also going to be asked about what your aims and what your mission is of your organisation. So make sure that you do have that's some of that work that you can do beforehand, is make sure you've got a strong kind of mission statement for what your organisation is and what you're looking to do. So just as I said with Thurso Community Development Trust, ours was like most, it's not particularly original because it's the same sort of thing as what most development trusts have, but our aim was to make Thurso a better place to live, work and visit.
I didn't catch that. Could you try again?
Sorry, I don't know if anybody can hear that, but for some reason my Siri is going off on my computer. But anyway, so that's your kind of standard sort of bits. They're going to want to know about your organisation track record. They're going to want to know a bit about what your aims and your mission are. And then you're going to have these set of questions that this funder wants to know about. And I wish I could tell you that every funder is going to ask the same questions. They're not going to. It's all going to vary slightly. Some of them will be very similar, which is a good reason to always keep the funding applications that you have written previously, keep them on file so that you still have them and you can still refer back to them. But basically, no matter what the questions are, it's always the same, like the same advice would be, is like, be clear and concise and just answer the questions. Tell the story, like they don't know you. That's another very key thing to remember, is don't write in a funding application assuming that that funder knows who you are and knows what your organisation is or knows what your project is. Always write it as if you are just starting from the beginning again, explaining as to who you are. And a good tip is to get somebody else to proof it for you who doesn't know that much about your organisation. So that kind of critical friend, to make sure that you've not worked on any assumptions, that you are clear and telling a clear story about who you are. Don't worry about using jargon. You don't need to use the fancy words. You don't need to be, things like sustainable development. You don't need to be using the fancy words whatsoever. They're more interested in what you can bring to your project. So don't worry in any shape or form about using jargon. Be aware of the word count. There generally would be always a word count that's up against a funding application. So like a max 400 words, 500 words. So just be aware of your word count. Some of these forms that we get, They're not great at actually being able to give you your word count. So maybe have another Word document open that you can cut and paste things so that you do have your word count, and you make sure that you're not going over it. Similarly, if a question on a funding application has a word count of 400 words and you've maybe only put in a couple of sentences, try and use that word count. Sorry, excuse me. My kind of tips around writing a funding application, and the way that it doesn't always work for everybody, but I go through this process of writing it, reflecting it, amend it, proof it, reflect and send. My favourite thing to do would be, particularly if I knew that I had a large funding application to write, would be getting up in the morning, and that is the one thing that I'm going to do today. And that's the one thing I'm going to focus on. And I would go and I would read through the questions, read through the guidance notes, then go out a walk with my dog, that the only thing I'd be thinking about while I'm walking my dog is that funding application, and then come back and start writing it. And then I'd go and walk away from it for a bit. That sometimes you need to just have that time that you can write a bit, then you can go away from it. Particularly because on funding applications, quite often, a lot of the questions are all very much similar. So you have to try and make sure that you are actually answering what it is that they want to answer. Another kind of top tip that I would have as well is that, particularly if you're faced with a large funding application, is go through it all first and then start putting bullet points of what it is that you're going to say to answer each of the questions in the boxes. And then that will help you to then start to shape the answers so that you're not repeating yourself. They can sometimes become a little bit repetitive. And then find somebody, if possible, to give a review on your funding application before you send it through. And then just going back to that is, yeah, this seems like a lot, but it's the more work that you've put in beforehand, then the less time it's going to take you when you actually come to writing that funding application, because you know your story, you know what it is that you need. And that's the bit that's actually the hard work, rather than, don't focus on the application as being the hard work. Think about the other bits that comes before that. That's actually the hard work, and making sure you know the community, that you know your project, you know how much it's going to cost, you know what it is that you're going to need, you know what it is that you're wanting to achieve, you know what it is that success looks like, and then you write the application around that. Is there any questions before I move on? I'm going to try and go through this one quite quickly because I have actually gone through some of it before. So this is just Monica.
Outcomes, sometimes the outcome might not be really what they want to hear, or do I have to do it the outcome that they expect, the funding you applied, to adhere to the outcome? Sometimes it seems to set out an outcome for you. They want you to from A to reach to Z. Is that a norm, or do I just write my own outcome, what I would like to achieve with the money?
I think that as long as you feel that the funder is a good match for you,
okay,
then I would write your own outcome.
Okay.
That's what I would say. I've got a little bit about outcomes further on, but yeah, I would genuinely be inclined to write your own outcome.
Okay.
Joan, we've also got a question from Hayley saying, do you ever reference?
How do you mean? So do I reference?
Hello, sorry.
Can
you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
I was just wondering, like, if you're adding any sort of technical detail, should it have a reference in terms of, like, as you would reference a research paper or something, just to, like, back up what you're saying?
If it's relevant to what it is that you're writing, Hayley, then yes. I have referenced other documents and research papers in funding applications. One of my favourite ones that I used to very frequently reference was there's a Joseph Rowntree paper which basically outlines the additional costs the additional hidden costs for living in rural areas. So I used to quite often reference that and include it in a reference.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
So this is just still to do with this. I've actually covered some of it, which I know I always do this and this when I do this, that I've kind of skipped forward and skipped back a little bit. So when you're on that application, so again, this is just like your basics of your, so it's going to start off with the basics of your organization details, the type of organization that you have. So this is something to be aware of as well, is that I don't know if there's anybody here that's from a community interest company, or maybe is just, if you're just with a kind of voluntary organisation which isn't a registered charity, goes back to that checking the criteria. So there is more and more that if you're a community interest company, a CIC, that you can apply for the same kind of funding as a registered charity can apply for, but you will sometimes have little bits of difference. One of the issues that I actually came into contact with recently was that in Thurso, there's actually two organisations that are linked together. One is the Community Benefit Society and the other is the Development Trust. And with what the Community Benefit Society does, which is basically the kind of trading arm of the trust, fits every single criteria for what the Robertson Trust are currently looking to fund, but they won't fund it because it's a community benefit society rather than a registered charity. So it is like, there will be a tick the box, and it is worth checking the guidance for whatever your legal entity is to make sure that you can apply for that funding. The next thing that's usually asked for is your charity number, so make sure that you know it if you are a registered charity. I already said about having that you might have to send a copy of your most recent audited accounts or certified accounts with a funding application. You may also be asked on a funding application what your income and expenditure was from a previous year, that you might actually need to fill that in boxes. So make sure you know what those figures are. If you're not the treasurer, then make sure that the treasurer or the finance officer can give you those numbers if you're not sure how to kind of read the balance sheets, because it can get confusing in charity balance sheets. One of the other things that you might be asked for that's similar to that as well is how many reserves your organisation, how much reserves your organisation has. And you may also be asked about why you can't use those reserves. I'll come on to that in a little bit further on. You'll be asked about who's your organisation. And again, that is one of my top tips, is that, tell us about your organisation. If you are doing multiple different projects, and tailor it for the funder, tailor it for whatever project it is that you're going to look for. And then in general, in terms of these questions, so they're all going to be phrased differently, but you're generally going to be asked for what you're looking to do, what says that this is a good idea. So where's the evidence from your community? What are going to be the outcomes of them giving you this money? And how are you then going to monitor and evaluate your project after that? So we go through some of those latter ones just in a bit. So Monica, you'd already asked about outcomes. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this because outcomes are not really my thing. I'm not great at them. But when you're asked for some outcomes on a funding application, and I've not experienced a funder yet that asks for outcomes in a similar sort of way. Some are very, so if you were, say, doing an application to Foundation Scotland, they are very quantitative focused in what they want their outcomes to be. So it needs to have some kind of number against it, basically. Like it can be, I think some of the last stuff that we applied for was kind of digital things, and it like what they were interested in was like how many people were going to be supported, how many devices were going to be given out, etc. Whereas you might have the lottery as a funder, that is much more intangible. Like they're not looking for maybe so much numbers, but they're looking to, it's more around people. but whatever you're doing for your outcomes is, and just as I kind of said to Monica, is that, like, don't be afraid to kind of write your own outcomes for what it is you're looking to achieve, but still try and make sure that they can be monitored and evaluated in some way. And so that is why it's better to use some kind of SMART outcome, so that you are that specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. It can be really, there can be a kind of enthusiasm if you're in the very early stages of a project to say, and it's one of your first projects, to say that we're going to have these workshops and we're going to have 500 people along to these workshops. Are you? Is there even 500 people that live in your community? Like, make sure that you're being realistic about it. As they don't always want to hear great, big, huge numbers. They just want it to be achievable and realistic, and that you can do it within the certain time frame as well. So it's that thing of, I'm trying to think of, my cold is hindering me slightly, and trying to think of my 2 examples that I used to give. But it's maybe something like, so we're gonna support, so you could just think about putting in as one of your outcomes, we're going to support young people to improve their mental health. Well, but actually a SMART outcome would be, through a series of workshops, we will support 12 young people to have more positive approaches to their mental health within a 12-month period. So that would be making that a SMART objective, rather than, so probably being less woolly and trying to take it into something that is kind of that specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So we've written the funding application, and now we've got to work out the money. The first thing is, so if you're applying for staffing, make sure that you're applying for, include your own costs as well. What many funders can do is, once you've actually secured funding, if something goes wrong with your project, the majority of funders, and I've not come across a funder yet that isn't prepared to have a conversation with you and maybe pivot your funding in some way or change your funding in some way. But what they won't be able to do is give you any additional money than what you originally applied for. So if you are applying for staffing costs, and I've seen lots of organisations coming a cropper with this, is that you put in for a salary post and you don't think that you're going to have to pay the employer's pension. You're going to also have to pay the national insurance contributions as well. You might also have training, you might have a laptop, a phone, these sort of things that you've maybe not quite thought about in terms of the staffing costs, but you will always have additional. You might have travel for them to attend a training course, there might be training that you need to provide them with. Those are all parts of your on costs that you're going to need for your staffing. I did mention it, I'm quite happy to send it out to anybody that needs it. I've got a spreadsheet, which, do you know, I use it all the time. It calculates what your on costs are, so it does the percentage, so that you know how much you'd have to pay an employer's national insurance and employer's pension contributions as well. And you can even change the numbers around if you need to, if you're doing a different pension contribution. So it's usually like 3%, 5%, or 8% is standard. You can change the percentage in it. There's also some funding. This is actually less so now, because I think this more happened during COVID. But the majority of funding that you apply for is going to be what's called restricted funding. So it means that it can only be spent on that project. And it also means that you have to basically spend all of it, or you might have to give some of it back. So say you're awarded £5,000 for a project, you only actually spend £4,000 of it. You might actually have to give the remainder of that back, or you might have to try and find something else to spend it on within that project. Unrestricted funding, that comes from, I mean, examples of types of unrestricted funding might be Tesco's, the tokens that you put in, the Bags for Life funding. The Co-op also has a really good fund. Donations that you might get. There was more unrestricted funding that was available during COVID times. I think things have got a little bit too tight for unrestricted funding, but there might be times that there is funding that you apply for that can actually be an unrestricted award, that it's just money to your organisation that you can spend however you want to spend it. Revenue costs as well. So there is some funders, not all, but if you were running an organisation that might have several different projects running, but you've got maybe like a core member of staff who's maybe like your admin, development officer, that type of thing, you can sometimes put in for revenue costs within a funding application. So an example of organisations that do that type of thing are Robertson Trust, the Lottery, that you might be applying for project funding, but you've got an office, you've got other things that need to be maintained. You can put in an element of revenue costs. So maybe how much it is for that staff member to use the desk there, to have the lights switched on, that you can put in that kind of money there. A key thing to be aware of, particularly when you're starting up, is that funding can quite often be paid in arrears. So you need to have something in the bank. You need to have some cash flow to support it, because you might actually have to spend the money and evidence that you've spent the money before you can actually claim it back. There are a lot of that exists maybe more with larger funders. Some of the Highland Council funds have been like that. But they're also usually quite happy to work with you in some way and maybe release some of your larger costs or release something to you if you are going to end up being in that situation. But it is something to definitely keep an eye on as to how they're going to pay that funding to you. My great story, and I'm aware of where we are with time just now, but the first funding that Thurso Community Development Trust ever got was European Leader funding and Caithness and North Sutherland funding. European Leader funding was just unbelievable, and the amount of paperwork and the amount of bureaucracy there was around it. But it was paid in arrears. Both of those funders paid in arrears. And we were very fortunate in that actually the Highland Council offered us loan funding to be able to keep the organisation going, because we had a staff post that was involved in it, and that we could then, so that we would then pay back the loan funding as we were able to put in the grant claims, which was great, but the entire process took such a long time. I remember we had the officer in post, and we managed to, through coffee mornings and through other bits of money, we managed to pay their December salary, and then we were going to pay their January salary, and I could see the days ticking down and the days ticking down, and this Highland Council loan funding hadn't come in. And we were very fortunate, because I actually thought that we were going to have to do a whip round and pay him out of our own pockets, because the day before his salary was due to be paid, we had, I think, £100 in the trust bank account. But fortunately, that night, there was £11,000 went in from the Highland Council. So we were able to pay his salary. But it is one that lots of organisations get caught with. But quite often you will find that a funder is amenable to, if they need to be able to release some of it to you, to be able to do it. Have you got, in terms of your funding finances, have you got some kind of system to record your finances? You're going to need to be able to keep everything. So making sure that you have, it can be just from very simply having a spreadsheet that you record all of your costs on, to if you're a large organisation, you might want to look at having something like Sage or QuickBooks, like an accountancy programme. Quite often those are actually available free of charge to charities and to non-profits. Sage definitely is available to charities free of charge through the Sage Foundation, but make sure that you've got some kind of a system that is going to record the finances that you've got coming in and going out. And then just always double check that you've got your numbers right. If you're sending off a funding application, if numbers are not your strong point, get somebody else to double check the numbers. Always double check your budgets. If you've not applied for enough, then you might have an issue then when it comes to actually running the project. So make sure that you haven't left anything out, because that is probably definitely the key thing to funders, is that they can't give you any more than what you've applied for. So make sure that you've got your numbers right on there. So then it comes down to you've now got this funding. You've got all of this funding. And yeah, to me, this is actually where the hard work starts, because you've got to monitor and report on all of that funding. You might have that you've got match funders, so you've got different funders, they've got different requirements for what it is that they want you to report on, that you need to monitor against the outcomes. And this can also be where there's a little bit of to and froing around that outcomes, as I've definitely had with funders that I've submitted the original outcomes that I've put into the funding application, and then they've come back and they've kind of said, oh, actually, we want you to kind of reduce those outcomes, or we want you to increase. You might have a little bit of to and froing with your outcomes and what they're actually looking for you to report against. But like, this is okay. This bit is part of a negotiation because you're successful with the funding. But so different funders are going to have different kinds of requirements. There are some funders that are not even going to ask you for a funding report. There are others that are. Have some kind of system that you've put in place, whether it's a spreadsheet, whatever it is, that you can just record things that you might be asked for, because this is another top tip. Some funders will agree with you when you get your funding award, what they want you to monitor and report on. Other funders won't. And you'll find a year later that you're getting a request to do a monitoring and evaluation report, and you might not have the information on it. So record some basic elements to do with your project. So the type of things that we're looking for is the number of people that have participated in your project, how many people you've helped. If you've done any form of evaluation, if you've done any form of survey with people, then keep a record of those. Pictures. Definitely take pictures of your projects. Pictures can tell 1,000 different stories. So if you have any press, so if you do any press releases, if you get anything into newspapers during the course of your project, funders love that as part of your monitoring and evaluation, to be able to submit back to them. Also, if you've got social media posts, if certain things got a high level of engagement, something like that, then you can include that within your monitoring and an evaluation. The other sort of things that they're going to ask for is that you definitely acknowledge your funders. That's fairly common and fairly standard practice, that there is something maybe in a press release or in your social media, on your posters, that you have your funders' logos on it. Keep a record of your financial records, because they may well ask, some funders are going to ask you for every single invoice that you pay on your project. Other ones are not going to be bothered. It just differs between the two. During COVID, that was one of the things, was that, you know, like some of the funding that we had during COVID, we were never asked for any form of financial reporting on it. Others, we needed to submit every single invoice and payment. I actually spent 2 weeks just compiling reporting for the lovely Highlands and Islands Enterprise. It was. I should be careful what I'm saying with this, getting recorded, but anyway. But if they have submitted, given you any reporting dates, be aware of what your reporting dates are, so that you're not surprised. You're not suddenly finding the night before, oh heck, I meant to have reported on this funding. And then you're likely to be running a charity, so there may be some form of audit at some stage or something, but keep everything. So your emails, your paperwork, and record everything. I definitely find, like, my emails, I just keep all of my emails and search through them if I'm needing to find anything. Even today, I had to find out some information for the trust, and I fortunately still had it in an email that was from 2 years ago. So keep bits and pieces that might be relevant. Find a folder, stick it away in it. And then in terms of that monitoring and reporting, don't be afraid to be creative around it. Sometimes the success of your project is not measured in how many people attended your project. A big one that there used to be was the Climate Challenge Fund, which no longer exists any longer. But the Climate Challenge Fund, all of our reporting was these big fancy spreadsheets that were reporting carbon emission, how much carbon emissions were being saved. Yeah, actually, that wasn't where the real benefit was in any of that project. Most of it was in terms of the numbers of people that were learning how to grow, the social isolation that was reduced, the mental health and the well-being aspects, that the improvements that were made there. So actually, a lot of the case studies from that were far more beneficial and far more told the story around the project than the actual numbers did. So, this is your second to last slide. My nose will be grateful of it. Funding claims. So, just your bits and pieces that you should have, that you should be aware of for doing funding claims, is that you may have to set aside a lot of time to complete it. You also will potentially need to be timely. So when does the funder expect a claim? So yeah, quite often a funder is going to, particularly if you're in that claiming things in arrears, and things might be tight because you're having to claim in arrears. So make sure that you are being timely with it. We're in that position with the hub. We claim in arrears every month. And so when it gets to actually tomorrow, I already start to get a bit antsy to make sure that we're putting our claim in, so that I know that it's definitely in the bank. Have your financial information ready. Be precise. Check and double check your figures for doing any form of a funding claim. And just in general, have sound finances and procedures. If you are running payroll and employing a staff member, then have sound payroll procedures. If you are employing a staff member, then it may be that they want to actually see wage slips. So it's good to have a record of those. Always be prepared for audit, which sounds like it's quite scary. I've never been audited yet in any form of, but like if we're running charities, we should always be prepared to have somebody that wants to just come and check to make sure that everything's okay. When you're doing your funding claim, double check and reference your bank statement. So again, part of that, you know, the first thing that there's nothing worse in is applying for funding and not actually having applied for quite enough money. The second thing is potentially leaving something off of your funding claim that you've forgotten to claim for, and that you don't get the money back from it then. So make sure that you double check and reference your bank statement when you're doing a funding claim. Also, just make sure that what you're claiming for is what you said you would spend your money on. Funder might come back and say, well, actually, we didn't agree on that. That's not what we agreed that you should be spending that money on. And then they'll refuse to pay it out. And so then you're left out of pocket. So if you are having to change what you originally said that you were going to basically spend your money on, then have a conversation with your funder first of all, because most funders are fairly happy to change things around for you, or to change budget lines around for you, things like that. If you are having to send a lot of details to a funder, then you might have to use Dropbox or a similar file transfer system. Do you know, I think I've got that in there because of the experience of Highlands and Highlands Enterprise and COVID funding. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. That's the only time that I've ever had to do that. So, so final top tips. There is no one golden avenue to find funding. You just need to do your research and build networks and resources. So that's going back to that, like, is there an ideal funding finder? Where do you find funding? Like, there's no one thing that I can say that is that Argyll and Butte funding finder is a good start. We're going to have a good go at doing a really, really good funding finder from the hub. but there's no one avenue to it. You're going to always find different bits and pieces. It's making sure that you know what's going on locally to your own area and where there might be funding. It's building up that networks. It's maybe following the right kind of groups and organisations and social media. Do your research. So that bit about understanding what the Scottish Government policy is and national framework funding trends generally follow this. That is true. Like, your funding trends do normally follow the national framework, which looks like it's quite a complicated diagram and quite a lot to get your head around. It's there for kind of 10 years or more. So you don't need to worry that it's going to change, but it is just looking at like what's the trends that are going to be coming along. I don't think that the trends that we have currently are going to change in a hurry. So we are headed towards a transformational future in terms of net zero. We are definitely in an economy at the moment that is struggling and that people are struggling. I don't think that those two main trends are going to change in any shape or form. Unfortunately, I don't think that trends are going to change in terms of how we need to prioritise well-being and mental health as well. Yeah, I think that's number 3, more research. So look at other projects, who funded it, particularly if you're starting off. It's a really, really good thing to have a look about at other projects that might inspire you and find out who funded those projects. That's a really, really good starting point. Rather than trying to wade through lots and lots of information, it's a really good starting point to find out who might have funded the projects that you aspire to and kind of start with those funders. Again, just as I said, is that if you do want to go and visit another project, if it's in our kind of area, then we can certainly arrange for what's called a community learning exchange, where your travel and your accommodation can be covered, but you can go and visit another project that's similar. And that's a really good way of getting to grips with a project that you might want to be thinking about doing in your own community, because if you're just looking at them on social media or on a website, you see the bright, shiny version. Whereas you actually go and speak to a project, you'll go and find it's not like it didn't go smoothly for them to get them to that point. I haven't found anybody yet that it has gone smoothly for. So it's a good way to build up that network, that connection, and know that you're not in it on your own. Like, there's going to be bumps in the road. If possible, particularly if you're thinking about a larger project, or if you've got various different projects you're wanting to do, have some form of a strategy, which doesn't need to be a fancy document. It could just be that you've sat down with your board, with your volunteers, and it's just like, what is it that we want to do? Where is it we want to get to? Just kind of think of what the bigger picture is. I'm a big believer of people sitting down in a room with big pieces of paper and marker pens and just trying to work out what it is that they want to do, and everybody then understanding what the bigger picture is. Make sure your numbers are right, kind of basics. Just always make sure your numbers are right. And then it's up to you how you decide to write. Maybe you've got different brains to me, but I certainly that kind of plan, reflect, write, reflect, review, reflect. Don't be afraid to go and do a bit one night. Walk away from it. That, like, funding applications, these forms quite often do, you feel like you're answering the same question repeatedly, but just in a slightly different way. So it can be a good idea to walk away from it and then go back to it. You also are going to have to tell your story usually quite concisely. So it's not a bad idea to be able to write a bit, go away from it, and just basically give yourself plenty of time to write it. Write clearly and tell your story. Don't worry about jargon. Don't worry about fancy words. Just clearly kind of tell your story. And don't give yourself any nasty surprises. Check that criteria before you are knee-deep in a funding application, which you then subsequently find out that you didn't match any of the guidance to be able to actually apply for it in the first place, which is also that don't waste your time if you don't fit the criteria. But also that don't give yourself nasty surprises. Don't be the person who's trying to submit something at midnight and realising that you don't have a copy of the Constitution or that you needed letters of support and things like that. Make a plan well in advance of what it is you're going to need to make sure you've got that documents on hand. And then once you're awarded that funding, then record everything. Just, if they haven't told you exactly what it is that they're looking for, just record everything. Do we have any questions on any of these bits? or anything else that anybody would like to ask? I'm going to actually stop sharing for a minute so that I can actually see people.
We've got a note in the chat from Monica and a hand up from Monica as well, asking about client testimonies and whether sort of feedback, I'm guessing, from service users is any good.
I would definitely say so, Monica. I think if you can weave that into funding applications, then that's really strong and really good evidence to have.
What about at the moment, I don't have any pay staff because I don't know how to do payroll. So I heard that SCVO do payroll. Is it a good way to go?
Yeah, it's you can go either via SCVO, they have a payroll service.
Yeah.
And theirs includes, it's like a payroll and HR service. Or you might find maybe like a local accountant or bookkeeper that can do it for you. Yeah, there's various different options that you can go in via payroll.
Just that because we are charity, company guarantee, but company limited by guarantee charity. So we have double whammy that we have report to Oscar and report to company house. So that's why I try to avoid the payroll. And I ask, the people who work for us are self-employed. So we don't have track record as an employer. So does it give us disadvantages?
I think it kind of varies. I don't think it would give you a disadvantage to be paying people as self-employed. There's a lot of voluntary groups and community organisations that do that as well.
Okay.
But yeah, you can access payroll services. I think it's just be aware of what the costs might be.
Yeah. Tell me about it.
Yeah.
When we change ourselves to company limited by guarantee from a box of tea for the volunteer, check out account to 2,500 a year.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
And I did all the work already. Yeah. Every month,
Yep.
Crazy.
Yeah. It's not cheap.
Can that be in the cost?
Unfortunately not.
No?
Generally, no.
Really? We can't claim the accountant fees, legal fees and professional fees? No.
There is very, very, no. No.
Yeah.
No. Generally, you would always have I think that's part of that. If there's funding where you can apply that there can be some kind of a management fee for the funding, then that can help give a contribution towards it. But unfortunately, there is very, very little that you can apply for that will cover your accountancy fees.
Crazy.
Yeah, and they ain't cheap.
But I have you soon. I'll be banging on your door every 2 seconds. Thank you. It has been very good. Because you have been there, it's better than people just telling you what to do. They have never feel one before, and it's nice. So you've been there, done that, have the T-shirt to show it.
Good. I'm glad that you feel that way. Yeah. I mean, it's tough. I feel for anybody that's kind of dipping that it's not a kind funding landscape at the moment. It's hard. But it is out there. It's definitely out there.
Oh, by the way, the council funding is all gone. 22, 23, 24 is not a penny left. And then has to wait for 24, 25.
Okay.
Yeah. I put in an application, but they say, sorry, no money left.
Right. Yeah. I'll get my thinking cap on. I'm not going to say that my thinking cap is very strong this week.
No,
Monica,
you need to go for a walk with your dog.
Yeah. I just need to go away and stop talking and blow my nose, I think is what I need to do.
Before we go away, should I just pop the links in for the Climate Hub funds as well?
Yes.
So, John, chat about them, Joan. But we have some funds open.
Why don't you do that bit, Vori? That would be really lovely.
Cool. Just to say as well, recognising we do some money. They're very short applications. They're aimed at community organisations, and they're usually around our climate action fund is about £500. We're currently doing a sort of fund at the moment, which is a bit of a kind of fund/support package around if you've got a community space that you're looking to become more sustainable, and then that's open at the moment. We can also offer food hygiene training certificates, certification, because that's often the barrier for becoming a community fridge. And we also run our climate festival in September, so later next year there'll be a couple of £100 to help run events as part of that. And yeah, just to say that as the hub, we have development officers, and we know that it's a challenge, we know it's hard work, so yeah, we're here to help at any stage, whether it's helping to find funding, reviewing applications, or just being a kind of friendly face to kind of help get through it. Yeah, we're there to support. And also in terms of events and training, if there's anything more that you want to see, we have a survey out at the moment for our hub members. So if you enjoyed this training and you want to see more of it, fill in the survey, because it helps us understand actually what your needs are, and yeah, how we can help you along your way. Is that okay, Joan?
That was very good. Thank you very much. Give me a chance to have a good sniff there. Is there anything that anybody else would like to ask before we finish tonight? We are certainly very happy to, if you want to have a conversation about your kind of individual funding needs or things that you'd like to, that you're thinking about, we are quite happy to have that conversation with you.
You mean in a separate day or now?
On a separate day.
Okay, yeah, right.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna be like, Joan
Overrun.
needs a cup of tea, I think.
Yeah.
In the bed.
Okay, great, thank you. It's very, very helpful. Thanks a lot.
Kate, thank you all. Thanks for coming. Thanks now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.